Hi, welcome to Synchronicity. Today we're joined by TJ Woodward. TJ is a revolutionary recovery expert, best-selling author, inspirational speaker, educator, and addiction treatment specialist who has helped countless people through his simple yet powerful teachings. The creator of the Conscious Recovery Method, a groundbreaking and effective approach to viewing and treating addiction. TJ is also the author of 3 best-selling books and their respective workbooks: Conscious Recovery, Conscious Being, and Conscious Creation. Welcome to the show, TJ.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to seeing where this conversation takes us.
Yay! Awesome. So can you tell us, for people who haven't heard of your work before, just a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this book?
Well, for me, the through line, I guess, if you will, or the common theme of all 3 of my books is this knowing that at the core of who and what we are, there's still this place that's unharmed and unharmable, that we came into this world as perfect, whole and complete spiritual beings, and then the world programmed us to believe that we were broken in some way. And so whether it's recovery or a spiritual journey or our journey through coaching or therapy, it really is about returning to that essential truth of who and what we are. That's really my passion, and it came out of my own story, but that's really the through line, and that's my mission now, is to help people rediscover their true nature.
Beautiful. So you actually run a recovery treatment center, correct?
I do not. No.
Oh.
Conscious Recovery is actually, it's an addiction treatment model that's used in programs throughout the country.
Okay, because I was watching a video about you and there was this treatment center and I guess they were using your model.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Oh, how did you end up being discovered by these treatment centers and them wanting to use your recovery model?
Well, I started working in the addiction treatment field in 2008. And at that time, there were a couple of things that were super striking to me. One is, I think unconsciously, clients were often being viewed as broken or damaged. And then also people kept coming back to treatment over and over and over again. And we just kept treating symptoms without helping people actually heal. So I developed this model. It was through my own experience, groups I was facilitating, and it eventually became a book. And at that time, I had worked in the field long enough that I had a lot of different partnerships and people that I knew. And so I started playing with this idea of bringing it to treatment programs. And the first program who adopted it, it was in 2018. And it's really just taken off since then, because it offers an additional tool for treatment programs to help their clients. And, you know, we're in the midst of this really acute mental health crisis and addiction crisis in our country and in our world. So I think any tool, one like mine, has been really welcomed and well received by treatment programs. Beautiful.
I love what you said. Well, I mean, it's painful to hear it, but it's so true, of that view that people are broken if they have addictions. And I notice that in the work that I do, as well as just out in the world, a lot of the time when throughout my work through this show, Synchronicity, I started out talking about the law of attraction. And at that time, it was like, well, don't talk about the bad things because you might make them happen, right? And so then we were like, well, then we've got to repress them and pretend, you know, that we're doing okay. And it's still, even though the idea of trauma is much more commonplace, it's part of popular psychology now, it seems like a lot of people are still really uncomfortable with anything negative. Like if I'm having a bad day, it's like, oh, I don't want to hear that you're having a bad day. I only want to hear the good stuff. Do you have any thoughts about why that is, or what your experience is in observing that?
Yeah, I mean, conscious creation is basically everything you're talking about. I was part of a New Thought community. I was part of a couple different communities, one in the early 90s in San Francisco, and then another one in the early 2000s. And it was very much what you were saying. It's like, oh, we don't talk about anything we consider to be negative. We really just move to all the positive. And there's something really useful about that. And even the law of attraction, at its root, it really is much deeper, but the way many people use it is much more on the surface surface, right? So it's only focused on the positive. But you said it so beautifully. What was happening, what happened for me, certainly in my own journey, what happened for me is I was repressing. I was pretending like the shadow work, if you will, the trauma, the shame that I was experiencing, that didn't really have a place to, be brought into the light. And so I think collectively, we are aware now that there's something much deeper here. The law of attraction, yes. And in addition to that, we do the deeper healing. When it comes to mental health and addiction, I think a lot of clinicians have been trained, for example, to only look at symptoms and behaviors. So this idea of kind of like looking at what we see on the surface, we are in the midst of a much deeper approach now. And I think it's true that, even, sort of in the popular psychology and the zeitgeist of today, we are talking about trauma and shame a lot more, which is very encouraging to me, as strange as that sounds, because then we can actually heal instead of just continuing to, sort of look at what is outpictured or what we manifest, right? We're really, something much deeper is happening now.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things, so I teach dialectical behavioral therapy skills in the work that I do, and I've been in DBT therapy myself. And there's times to push those emotions away and distract ourselves and just change our focus. But there's also times when it's really important to sit with that. And like the saying goes, you've got to feel it to heal it. If we're only ever distracting and ignoring and avoiding, we don't actually move through it and we don't overcome it.
That's right. And I love the way you're talking about it, because all of these different tools we use are useful. And then there's also this deepening or this other approach, which is not only do I because in some of the models, it's opposite action, or we might say act as if. We hear that in recovery circles sometimes. Distract ourselves, go from unhealthy to healthy emotions. We could do an entire conversation on that, because is there any such thing as a negative emotion? Some would say yes, but the truth is, if we actually allow ourselves to sit with and experience what's there, we move through it. A very small child innately does this. They feel very deeply. They let us know exactly what they're feeling. And then if we allow them to be present with that, then they move through it and they go back to their homeostasis, which is joy, right? And so in my experience, our natural state is joy. That doesn't mean we're always experiencing that necessarily, but when we allow ourselves to experience all the other things, right? Not the negative things, but just whatever's present, we actually, they organically move through us. There's information there. And that really is this deeper healing that we're talking about today.
That brings up a memory from childhood. I was about 9. And I had been put up for adoption and was with this family, and they had a little boy who was about 5. And I would see him throw a tantrum and right? And then he was fine.
Right.
And in my 9-year-old, already traumatized, repressed brain, I saw that and I was like, the fact that he can just let it out and move on, that means he was faking it. He was just doing it for attention.
Right.
Right. And God, I'm going to tear up thinking about it, because I hear this in my work so often, is when someone acts out, oh, they're just looking for attention.
Right. Right.
And we're trying to get a need met. We're trying to express and be validated.
Right.
What do you want to say about that?
Well, I mean, everything you said is so touching to me too, because I also remember being really young, and at age 7, I actually have a very clear memory of closing down. It was like everything became too painful, right? And I don't know what my brain as a 7-year-old was saying about that, or what I was thinking, but there was a sensation of I needed to protect myself, right? And I think that there's truth to that. But what happened because of that is I then cut myself off from the love and connection that I truly desired. And I also started, playing this tape. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I'm not lovable. And also, as you said, I also decided that, I can't be so sensitive. I can't be so emotional. you know, the phrases that come to mind are, if you're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. You know, go to your room and so you can stop crying. Here's a piece of candy. Now, some people think this might be minor, right? And for some, it could be. For others of us, that could be really significant, because what happened in my experience and what I see happening in a lot of people I've worked with in their experience is there's a message that it's not okay to be ourselves. There's a message that we need to bury things. And that right there, our little brains aren't even developed enough to understand what's happening. So it happens on an energetic level, or the level of frequency. So I went from being open and effervescent and loving to closed and afraid. And I stayed that way for many, many years. And, you know, it took me decades to be in the process of unlearning some of that.
Thank you for sharing that, TJ. Yeah, I almost feel like what parents and all of us need to learn, because we're in romantic relationships, we're kind of parenting each other. When we're in these close friendships and even with work colleagues, like, I feel like we all need to learn that it's important to validate and show care and compassion for these uncomfortable emotions. I don't want to call them negative emotions. They can be very uncomfortable, but
Right.
Our emotions are there to actually inform us that something is amiss, that we need something that's not being met.
Right.
And
It's an internal navigation system, right? If there's an emotion, and like you said, I like the reframe of uncomfortable, because certain emotions are pleasant to me and certain are not pleasant to me. But the truth is they all hold information, right? And I love the way you're talking about it, because I think we've been in the let's not feel that, that's bad, that's negative. Because as soon as I decide something's negative, then I want to get rid of it. And getting rid of the emotion isn't really the path to freedom. It really is about learning to be with myself, asking questions. I wonder what this emotion is wanting to reveal to me. I think there's this idea that if we feel it, we're going to get stuck. And the truth is, if we don't feel it, we're going to get stuck. So it's sort of paradoxical in that way, or counterintuitive at least.
Absolutely. And I do feel like I think that we need to learn as parents and as supporters for the other people in our world. We need to learn how to validate and sit with our uncomfortable emotions and other people's uncomfortable emotions. And then if the child or the person that we're supporting is not able to move through it, if they're ruminating on it and they're getting stuck on it and adding a bunch of story, then that might be the time to say, hey, I can see that this is actually causing more distress. How would it be if we do something to distract? But not immediately going to, okay, we got to change the subject because this is uncomfortable for me, or I'm worried if you share your emotions, you're going to start crying and you'll be unconsolable, and then I won't know how to handle it, right? That, I think a lot of it comes from people are pushing it away because they can't handle sitting with that emotion.
I would say probably about 100% of the time, right? Yeah. I mean, if we look, I think about a child on an airplane having what we call a temper tantrum, really emoting, the parent might go into shame, and try to stop the child because they're uncomfortable, is distracting people. That is a very obvious example. But what you're talking about, I think, is so important, because in so many ways, if I'm not comfortable with my own emotional inner landscape and being present with it, then I can't be that for you. And then we end up either fixing or thinking, if I hand you a Kleenex or if I put my hand on you, all these things oh, please don't feel because it's too painful for me. You said something that I think is so important, and I wanted to kind of go back to it. You just said it in passing. It's so powerful. What story am I attaching to the emotion? That's what happens, right? So I have an emotion, and then many of us have been deeply conditioned to say, well, why am I feeling this way, right? And then we start looking at why we feel that way, or we attach a story to it. See, I'm always just going to be sad. See, we go into the story. And so one tool that I use is very, very simple, but it is, what would I be experiencing without a story? Right? To look at what the sensation is and notice the mind wanting to either go into fix it mode, get to the root of it, distract myself, and just be present with it. It's something that's happening in my body. And then I can ask questions like, I wonder what's wanting to be revealed. What might happen if I sit with this, even if it's for 1 minute or 30 seconds? For some of us, that's like an eternity, because many of us have spent decades running away from the emotions.
Mhm. And gosh, that brought up a thought. Like I kind of think that part of the reason that we start telling stories about the emotion is because our society or our childhood, we've been so invalidated so many times that we need the story to justify our feeling.
Oh, that's so true. I love that you're leaning into that, because that really is true. Then, because if I have a story about it, then I justify it, because there's some in our we're swimming in this consciousness of certain feelings are acceptable and certain feelings are not, right? And then it's based on gender, it's based on age, it's based on race. I mean, it's based on a lot of different things, like I know it's changing gender roles, but many of us, like for me, a man, like men don't feel, right? There's no sensitivity there. Men can be angry, they can be strong, that there's certain things that are attributed to positive and certain things that are negative. And so when we attach a story to it, I love what you're saying, because then it's like, see, it is okay that I feel this way, which, by the way, of course it's okay to feel that way. We don't need the story to justify it. The issue, though, is we end up trying to figure it out. We go into our mind, we try to, and I love the models like DBT and CBT and a lot of the models, and sometimes they end up being cerebral, right? Like, let me change the narrative, let me change the story, which of course can be useful, but it's like, okay, but there's something deeper here. And that deeper for me is, I decided this at such a young age that it's buried deep in my unconscious. So it's not just about changing the narrative that is useful, but it's actually going back and becoming curious about when that originated and what has been the impact in my life from that moment on.
Mhm. So TJ, it sounds like your opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it is important to go back and actually analyze the root of it, whereas some forms of therapy are more focused on the here and now and building the skills to move forward, and they don't actually go back into that repressed trauma. What are your thoughts on what's been most effective for your observation and experience?
Well, it's so interesting, and I'm so happy you asked the question, because what I'm not saying is that we must go back and re-experience every traumatic event we've ever had, because it is about what's showing up now. Bessel van der Kolk, I love what he says, a trauma doesn't show up as a memory, it shows up as a reaction. So it's happening in real time, but it's happening in real time based on something that happened in the past. And for many of us, we're not even aware of it. So we might be on Twitter, we might be, and we get activated, right? Formerly known as triggered. I don't use the word trigger. And then we must respond, right? We must react because these people are wrong. And that's sometimes, not always, but sometimes a trauma response. So it's a nuanced conversation, because what we want to be curious about is what's happening in real time. What am I noticing? What's the reactivity? Where is this in my body? Again, Bessel, the body keeps the score. What we want to do is say, when did this originate? Not to go back and re-experience the trauma. And here's the key. It's less about what happened and more about what we decided about what happened that creates the experience of now, the reactivity. We're not minimizing what happened, but sometimes we think, if I could just remember exactly what my second grade teacher did, right? We're in the blame of that. But what instead we want to say, I'm noticing that I get really reactive around this particular thing. I wonder where this originated. If I can remember a time that something happened and I decided something about myself and the world, that's the point of power, because we can start to work with that.
So when we can, sorry, did you have more to say?
No.
Okay. So it's
always, but yeah.
It sounds like what you're saying is that we kind of need to inquire. It was reminding me of Gabor Mate's Compassion and Inquiry. So we kind of need to inquire of, like, where is that coming from? Because the origin of that is connected to a belief that we have about ourselves or the world.
That's right. And in conscious recovery, I call it core false belief. And the reason I add the false is we want to acknowledge that these are lies that we picked up about ourselves with very limited information. The brain of a young person, and I don't know all the levels of brain development, but I do know that very important age, something like 3 to 8 years old, we have very concrete thinking. One of my parents is happy, I must be a good child. One of my parents is angry, I must be bad. It doesn't need to be logical because our brains aren't even developed. So we develop the shame, we bury it, it becomes concretized in our unconsciousness. And what happens is, as adults, we try to talk ourselves out of it, right? We start to say, well, of course you're lovable. Dad having affairs with other people didn't mean you were unlovable. That was about him. Yeah, okay, I understand that as an adult. But as a 4-year-old, as a 5-year-old, there's something much deeper here. And so if I can go back and start to, and I love that you use the word inquiry, right? Because we want to start becoming curious about it. I'm not trying to talk myself out of the decision. I'm becoming aware of it. I'm becoming aware of how it feels in my body. I start asking open-ended questions. What happens when I believe this? What would it be like to be free? What else is possible here? But not from the place of the adult, really from a place of tenderness with the inner child, that young child that lives within us that can be causing this reactivity.
Mm-hmm. I gotta say, even as an adult, like the idea of, yeah, if my dad was having affairs, I think as adults, we can separate the logical, like, of course, that was his issue, his addiction, whatever it was, not me. But emotionally, even as an adult, when you said that, I was like, yeah, but if he loved us, our family more, he would have tried harder not to do that. Right.
And then we want to look at, if we can get to the point of what did I decide about myself? It doesn't need to be logical, because that's where we get tripped up, right? I couldn't tie my shoes in kindergarten one day before recess. This is a true story. It might have been first grade, but I can remember it like it was yesterday. I literally recited to myself, I'm so stupid. I said it to myself so many times walking home from school that day. And I remember just believing that. And of course, logically, as an adult, I'm like, I know that's not true. First of all, I'm left-handed and they were teaching me right-handed, right? So there were all these, but that didn't change it. What changed it was like going back and saying, oh my gosh, my poor 5-year-old or 6-year-old, what did that feel like? Because I remember freezing. I remember absolutely freezing at that moment and thinking, oh my gosh, everyone else knows how to tie shoes. And so we want to go back and start to thaw that out, because it's actually possible to have a different conclusion about ourselves. And then we actually change the trajectory of our life from the past. It's almost like we change the past because we can go back and change those core decisions.
Beautiful. And yeah, our brains and our memories, when we go back and every time we bring up a memory, it shifts a little bit, right? So if we're able to bring up a memory with more compassion and more insight, it can shift over time, right? But that story about your experience with the shoe tying, it wasn't just being aware of the other kids being able to tie it. There was also a person in authority, an adult, who added on to that already probably internalized shame you were experiencing.
Yeah. It was, the teacher sent me home with a little board with 2 shoes on it. And I think that I'm going to say that was probably well-intentioned for a while. And maybe this is part of the healing. For a while, I got really angry at her and blamed her. And then at some point I realized it's not really about that. It's really about what was the impact on me, right? My mother, for example, I was born in 1965 in the Midwest. And so all the children's books at that time were like, don't over coddle, don't give your child too much love. Let them cry it out. It's okay to leave them alone. Don't, all these things about like, just let them be, right? Not to mention that, back in that day, men were taught not to show a lot of emotion. My dad only met his father one time. He shook his hand once, right? And so my dad, to me wasn't very emotionally available, but to him, he was being a wonderful father. He was in my life every single day. So the reason I say all this is it's not really about blaming them, because I did that for a while, right? I blamed my parents. And then I realized that it's not really what they were doing. Of course, they could have been better parents. We all learn, the best thing we can say to anyone who's a parent, just, I forgive me. I forgive me. I'm not a parent. I'm not going to be a parent, but I do understand the level, the weight of what it must feel like to try to be a conscious parent every single moment. But it really is about going back, and you've said it a couple of times, and I love this. It really is about allowing ourselves to feel that which we couldn't feel before.
Thanks, TJ. So TJ, you have a whole section on shame and empathy. So can we talk? I've heard the word shame coming from both of us a couple of times already. So can we talk a little bit about shame?
Yeah. So in my book, Conscious Recovery, I identify shame as one of the root causes of addiction. It is the root cause of many things that we see in our culture. Shame, of course, most of us have heard this by now, but it still merits saying it. The difference between guilt and shame: guilt is, I believe I've done something wrong. Shame is, I believe that I am wrong. We work with them fundamentally different, because guilt is behavioral, right? So if I did something to harm someone, I can go back, I can apologize, I can make amends, I can learn to not do that again. I feel better. But shame is, I can't believe I did that. I'm broken. See, I am broken. It's true. So I believe I'm broken. I act broken in the world, and then I say, look, it is true. I am a damaged person. And then we're in this downward spiral. For me, the pioneer of who's been talking about shame was John Bradshaw in the 1980s in his book, Healing the Shame That Binds You. He was the first person that I know of that was connecting shame and addiction. And the model back then was like, it's none of that. It's just a disease, right? And, we could debate the disease model for a whole hour, but he was saying, okay, maybe it is, but it's also this. It's also this shame, this belief that we're broken, and that addiction is an outpicturing of that shame. And to me, that rings very, very true.
Yeah, if you want to talk about the disease model, shame is the disease.
Right.
The addiction is the symptom of the disease, right?
That's right. That's right. And when we look at how we heal shame, we look at it very differently. It's not behavior. I mean, it's behavioral in a way, but it's not, I'm just going to go act differently. I think that's a model that can bring great results. Opposite action. We hear that in 12-step meetings. We hear that in CBT and DBT, opposite action. And it's really useful. I want to be clear. And then we also need to look at the impact of shame, where it originated. It's kind of everything we've been talking about. But what I want to say about it is it needs to come into the light, right? I love the way Brene Brown talks about it. She says the three things that cause shame to, I think she says, thrive in a petri dish. I love that, her science mind, is secrecy, silence, and judgment. So we want to look at what the opposite of those three might be. We could use different words, but it's being authentic, being vulnerable, telling the truth about ourselves, being seen, creating authentic community. That's the way we heal shame. It's very, very different than just go out and act differently.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is bringing up so many thoughts. I don't even know where to take it, but I'm just enjoying this conversation so much, TJ. Again, TJ Woodward, what is your website? We should... tjwoodward.com, or Instagram is tjwoodward_. That's a great place to find everything too. Beautiful. And the book is Conscious Recovery. I love the little bird cage.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a great story with that. Someone went through the Conscious Recovery process, and reached out to me and said, I do graphic design and branding, and I would like to offer you a branding package. I have this image that keeps coming to me with your book. And the first edition of Conscious Recovery had a very different image, and he created all of this for me because of the impact it had on his life. So not only is that, I think, an image that really, I think, speaks to conscious recovery, this idea of freedom, but it came from someone's personal experience with the work. So I absolutely love it as well.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Isn't
Thank you
that, I
for
love
sharing.
that. Yeah, he's such a
Yeah,
great guy.
it adds even more meaning to anyone who's looking at the image now that they know the story. Um, so when we talk about shame, like that's another thing. I work in mental health and substance use services, and there's all of these, like, it seems like there's all of these conflicting ideas, and there's the what the evidence says, and then there's what our all of our past histories and beliefs and all of the shame and the judgment that all of the professionals come in with, all of our biases, the clients and patients, their biases and judgments, the families, all of it is just kind of all like intermingling. And it almost seems like there's progress being made, but it seems like there's a bit of struggle. I'm so glad there's some treatment facilities that are using your model. But there's a lot of, like, there's the harm reduction model, then there's the forced abstinence model for people who maybe are being held against their will in some cases, right? And then there's the shame. So we're supposed to be talking about our feelings and talking about our symptoms and our experiences and our trauma, but a lot of the time people are so uncomfortable with it, or there's this focus on safety, which absolutely is important. So one example is someone who's having feelings of hopelessness and maybe thoughts of suicide, right? And if you're getting mental health treatment, that's supposed to be the safe place to say, hey, I'm feeling hopeless and the pain is so much that it makes me not want to live anymore. That
Right.
should be a safe place to say it. But because we focus so much on the immediate safety, it's often the result is that it's actually not safe to say that, because then everybody's like, oh no, we got to make sure now you can't go anywhere, and we got to watch you, check on you every 15 minutes, you know. So I don't know exactly what my question is, but what are your thoughts on all of those conflicting priorities?
Well, you are now like singing my song, right? Because this is the mission and the passion of conscious recovery. You started by talking about biases and judgments, right? And so as clinicians or counselors or techs or nurses, anyone, working in mental health or behavioral health, we do bring our own biases into it. And you also touched on something that I think is at the root of this, and this is really my purpose and my mission. If I haven't healed my own trauma, it's very difficult for me to be present with someone else's. And maybe a more accurate way of saying that is, if I'm not in the process of healing my trauma, there's not a finish line. I don't get to like, yay, I'm all healed now. But if I'm in the process of healing, I can be present with someone else's without going into the reactivity of like, I've got to keep this person safe. Working in the addiction treatment space, a lot of times we say, well, we're a short-term care program. We don't address trauma. We just stabilize them and give them the tools they need. And although that logically makes sense, what about the people who keep coming back to treatment 5, 6, 7, 8 times? And then we say to them, what are you going to do differently? Or when are you going to surrender and just do what we tell you you need to do? And so my deeper work with conscious recovery is I go into treatment facilities and I don't teach about what it means to truly be present and hold space. We actually experience it. And we begin to recognize, not do I have biases, but what are they and how are they affecting this field? And when I say field, I'm talking about the field of presence. The foundational principle of conscious recovery is underneath all addictive behavior is an essential self that's whole and perfect. So if I've been trained to diagnose and treat, and you're talking with me, yeah, God forbid if you say you feel like you might not want to be on the planet, oops, alarm bell, 5150, which means, we basically lock them down for 72 hours. That would be at the most extreme, I would say, but it signals something within us. And as you said so beautifully, that's not safety. Conscious recovery, I identify the first step of recovery as safety, once we've identified the root causes. And so as a clinician, if you're talking and I'm supposedly listening, but while you're talking, I'm nodding, but in my mind, I'm diagnosing you or coming up with a treatment plan or thinking I know that I'm not truly present with you. And being truly present with someone is being co-curious. That's the first time I've ever used that term, but being co-curious with a client is, let me help them access their own inner wisdom. They're the ones that have the answers within them. It certainly doesn't mean they can do it alone because they're in front of me for a reason. People come to treatment at their most desperate and painful time of their life. We're there to serve them, but we're not there to fix them. That's a very, very different way of being with someone. And to me, as you've said, this idea that we just keep putting on Band-Aids and keep, treating the symptoms, there's something much, something's wanting to emerge here that's very different than that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And also when it comes to going back, cycling back into the system again, each time that happens, there's more trauma, because the trauma of all of what transpires while you're in active addiction, the trauma of getting the treatment, whether it's safe or not, sometimes it's involuntary. And then when there's a lot of substance use, it can actually change the wiring of the brain. So each time people go through that cycle, like, we need to be able to support people in, hey, this is your first time accessing help. Let's make it a safe experience so you're not avoiding it for the rest of your life and drowning your sorrows in your addiction.
That's right. And you didn't quite say this, but as you were speaking, I was reminded of a very simple way to say it, and that is shame doesn't heal shame. And specifically in the addiction treatment models, and sometimes in the mental health models, we're adding shame unconsciously. What's wrong with you? We tell people, I don't want to get too technical, but the DSM is something that we look at to identify what a person's diagnosis is. And it's intended to help people, but it's 100% based on symptoms. It's not based on any kind of biological testing. And all of that's great, right? Because the behavior helps us see what might be going on. What happens, though, is we often stop at the behavior and we label it as a disorder. And sometimes we tell them it's organic and biological, and it might be, but it also might not be. There's not this one answer. If you look at traditional, like going back, the recovery models, I mean, when I got sober in 1986, this is literally what I heard people say: sit down and shut up. You don't know anything. Your best thinking got you here. This is the last house on the block. You're going to die if you don't. Well, maybe you just haven't hit bottom. I mean, these things that are so aggressive, and the energy is still in the field of behavioral health. It's still there. There's still an idea that this person is disordered. There's something wrong with them, and I need to fix them. And that paradigm adds more shame to the shame. What we want to do is add light. We want to bring light to the darkness. We don't want to bring more darkness to it. And so we're in the midst of this profound shift, and I'm grateful to be part of it. I'm grateful you're part of it. I feel like in the last 10 years, we've been coming out of the closet. I mean, really, like clinicians I know are like, wait a minute, there's something else happening here. It's not just all this biological and behavioral. There's also this, for me, I call it spirit, right? But there's this place of essentially holding someone and allowing them to actually heal. So you can tell I'm excited about all of this.
Yes. And there's, I'm rephrasing what you said about what the root of conscious recovery, but there's this precious being inside that is whole and perfect. And we're calling it a disorder, but it's really just the layers of the world and the trauma and our hurts that are covering it up. And we need to start opening that up and removing the layers of pain and shame.
Yeah, and exploring them, right? Because in conscious recovery, I call them brilliant strategies instead of coping mechanisms, right? They're a brilliant strategy. So, again, not to get too technical, but if someone has a borderline personality disorder, gosh, if you think about that, those words, if they have that diagnosis, if we only look at the behavior, we might have judgment about all of that. But if I say, what's the longing? What's at the root of this? Someone the people who I've worked with who have had that diagnosis, they want to be seen and heard and validated. And usually there's a deep wound of not being seen and heard and validated at a very young age. And then the way they've adapted to an insane environment, right, to name it, is they've come up with these strategies to feel safe. And they worked in the beginning. The issue is they're no longer really working for them, but it's not my job to tell them that. It's my job, again, to like be co-curious with them so they can start to explore, of course I did this. This helped me feel safe. When I was 6 years old, this behavior started because it helped me feel safe. It's not bad behavior. It's not a disorder. It might not be bringing me what I truly desire. And when I start getting in touch with that, then we can start looking at like what would help me begin to create the life that I truly desire. That's a really different way of looking at mental health, addiction, well-being, all of it.
Beautiful. Oh, there's so many directions we could take this. When you bring up the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and you were talking about the DSM earlier, I noticed the thought coming to mind is that they have the DSM, which the purpose of that is to know what treatments might be effective.
Exactly.
Right. But then it gets into popular psychology. And now on Twitter, we're calling everyone a narcissist.
Exactly. And I'm sure I qualify. That's for sure. Right. Yes, that's right.
One of the things that is, and we've talked about men and how their emotions, our society has not created a safe space for male emotions other than anger. And pornography addiction is a really big one. And that, I think, also goes hand in hand with that pop psychology label of narcissist, because if he'd rather watch porn and avoid his partner, then he must be a narcissist.
Right.
So
right.
I'm wondering if you've come across any of that, or you have thoughts on that subject.
Yeah, so many layers. I mean, the whole conversation of narcissist and empath, because that's usually what we attach. I'm the empath and they're the narcissist. So I'm immediately setting up that I'm the good one and they're the bad one, or I'm the victim, right? I want to be clear. I'm not saying that, of course, especially children, we're not responsible for the trauma that happened to us, but we are now responsible for the healing of that trauma, not from a place of self-blame, but when we're blaming the world, we're stuck. And that, seems to be part of the journey. We want to empower someone if we move beyond the label of narcissist, because we just think, if I can remove this toxic relationship, then I'll be fine. So I cut the person and then I go to the next one. This person's going to be different. And then 6 months in, I'm like, oh my gosh, this person's a narcissist too. I cut that person, and we see the pattern. We're not talking about blaming ourselves at that point, even though that's what I did for a long time. And that was very unpleasant. I went from blaming the other person to blaming myself for at least a decade, I would say. The deeper approach here is to say, I'm going to empower myself now to look at what the core false beliefs that I'm holding that have caused me to continue to choose this relationship. And if we want to go even deeper, we want to say, what am I wanting someone to be available for? Because we'll say, why do I keep attracting unavailable people? Mm-hmm. Well, am I wanting them to actually do my healing work for me? Because that's not actually possible. I know you talked about porn, and I didn't want to, I went on that little tangent. I think porn, like anything else, is an out-picturing. We could say it's a brilliant strategy, right? It's managing something. I think about young people, young people that have access online to everything. So we see people now exposed to hypersexuality, if you will, at a very young age. I don't think we've yet seen the full impact of that. There's a desensitization that happens to that. I think this idea that if someone really loved me, they wouldn't watch porn is something you would want to investigate. Let's just put it that way, right? Is there maybe something else going on? I always want to go back to what's the deep longing, what's the deep desire here? And is porn actually getting me what I desire? It might give me like the instant gratification, if you will, just like many things that we might call an addiction. But is it really bringing me what I desire? And if my partner is doing that, see if I can not go into judgment, but stay in curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, TJ. And I wanted to bring it back actually to the toxic relationship, because it can be anything, right? So there's the term narcissist, and then there is the, oh, this is a toxic person. And what I find is that, I mean, there are some people, I'm not denying that abuse exists, because it absolutely does. And it can cause harm, huge harm. And when we put it outside of ourselves and we say, well, that person's a narcissist, that person's toxic, and I'm the good guy,
Right.
we fail to see the dynamic that we create, because there are some people, like, I've been called toxic, yet most of my relationships are incredibly healthy and mutually, like, supportive and warm and loving. And yet to one or two people out there, I'm a toxic person. So, and there have been people that I've labeled as toxic, and then I see them have a relationship with someone else and it's completely different. And it's like, well, why do they treat that person with love and respect and compassion and not me?
Right.
So I think we need to get away so much from these labels that otherize the person and dehumanize this other person, and look at what is the dynamic that we're sharing. What are the traits that we're bringing out the worst in each other, and how can we either remove ourselves from that, or learn to, like, at least in the next relationship, avoid people who bring out those traits, or learn how to behave differently, so that, like you said with the porn, like, rather than being so reactive about it, if we can be co-curious, then maybe this relationship could actually still be healthy.
Yeah, I mean, the layers of what you're saying are so important and so powerful, because in our culture today, which is amplified by social media, we see, I mean, I was getting coffee recently, and there were these two women, probably early 20s, reading a book, and they were saying, see, this is what they mean by toxic, and this is how you get rid of toxic people. So there are literally books that are saying, this is how you get rid of toxic people. As we've said, and this is more than just a disclaimer, although it is a disclaimer, we're not saying stay in an abusive relationship. Neither one of us are saying that. But what we're saying is that's not the end all and be all, right? And so I'm going to tell it from my own story, because I think my own story really is perfect demonstration of this. I got sober when I was 20. Right before I turned 21, and I had developed a very, very deep shame core and believed I was unlovable. I had these two conflicting core beliefs. One was everyone is going to like me, and the other one is I'm unlovable. And those are so interesting together, right? So I found myself 5 relationships in a row, the first 5 years of my recovery, and these were beautiful people that could not possibly love me, for a lot of different reasons. And I kept saying, they're so wonderful. Why can't they love me? Right. And I was in this victim mode, because here were these beautiful people, and I was just thinking I could reach them. Right. One of them was very addicted. And I thought, well, if he could just, not use heroin, he would love me. And another one was confused about his sexuality, which, by the way, was the theme, right? Because I kept thinking, there's someone. So here, let's break it down for a minute. It's not a thought, it's a frequency. So I believed I was lovable intellectually. I understood that I was lovable, but at a very deep level, I was vibrating with this I'm not lovable frequency. And I would walk into a room and I would unconsciously vibe, if you will, or vibrate with that person to confirm the core false belief. It didn't mean they were bad people. I was literally choosing them to confirm the core false belief. I'm like, oh my gosh, here's a person. He's so wonderful and so handsome and so articulate and so sweet. And then I'd be like, but he can't love me, right? And I thought, well, if he could just love me, I'd be happy. So as I realized after the 5th one, oh, it's not about them, because, staying in that frequency of blame and victimhood is on some level reassuring, if you will, or on some level, it's easier because I can just blame the world. But when I realize that I am accountable, not that I'm to blame, but I'm accountable, then I realize that the true empowerment is healing the core false belief. I don't need to really change the relationships. None of these guys were abusive to me. So if someone's hitting me, yes, get out of the relationship, right? And even if that's the case, that's only the first step. It's sort of like addiction. Yes, the first step is to stop drinking and using, but then we need to explore what's going on underneath that. And so for me, when I started to heal the original wound of I'm not lovable, the frequency started to change and the relationship started to change. And I would love to tell you that it was a moment that I woke up and felt lovable and suddenly everyone in my life was loving and present, but it was a much deeper process and a longer process for me.
Thank you for sharing that, TJ. And what you said about accountability versus blame, one of the sets of skills that I teach is the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And one of the 5 key concepts of mental health recovery is personal responsibility. So that accountability and that personal responsibility is mandatory if we're ever going to recover in whatever way that looks like for you. But I think that personal responsibility, you can't have that without the compassion. You have to have compassion for yourself, for, yes, I am accountable for this, even though my dad beat me up and he was an alcoholic and my mom was a narcissist or, whatever. But now that I'm an adult, this is the hand I've been dealt. I'm responsible for playing it to the best of my ability, but that doesn't mean I'm a loser if I'm having challenges with it. The accountability also has to be combined with self-compassion, or you're just going to be stuck.
Absolutely, right, because that's what I did. I shifted from blaming them to blaming myself, and I stayed in that for many, many years. See, it is true that I'm unlovable. I knew it. I am to blame. And then I was very aggressive with myself. Like I came into, and we talked about this earlier, I came into this community and this teaching that was like, don't talk about anything negative. Don't talk about this shadow. Look in the mirror and say, I am whole and perfect and lovable. And I went about that and trying to manifest the perfect partner. But the whole time I was blaming myself. So I think the shift from blame to accountability is a powerful one, because once I'm starting to become accountable, I'm actually empowering myself. We're giving our power away when we're stuck in the story, or when we're stuck in he's a narcissist or she's a narcissist, they're a narcissist, right? When we're stuck in that, there's no empowerment, because they have the power. And if I could just get rid of them, then I could be happy. We're talking about something that is very, very much about taking that power back. I mean, I've worked with people, as I'm sure you have, who have had severe trauma, like sexual trauma. And the healing of that isn't saying that it was okay. The healing of that is saying it happened, it had this impact on me. And if I continue to blame that person, sometimes they're not even alive, and I'm giving them all the power, I'm going to pull the power back and say, I have the ability to heal. This is no longer about making it your fault, but we want to be careful. We're not pretending like it didn't hurt. We want to be really aware of the impact it had on us, or the effect that it's had on us, but to take our power away from they did it to me to I can actually heal now. I'm the person that can pull that, in conscious recovery, there's a whole chapter called Owning Our Power. We're taking our power back. We're not powerless over that.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out, like, saying what happened is not okay.
Yeah.
That when someone does something to create trauma for someone, that's not okay.
Right.
And now that it's happened, how do I move forward? Because I can't change it.
Right, right. And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because the mind, and I don't know if it's because we've been programmed with this, that, right, wrong, good, bad. And so when we get into the conversation, we'll say, oh my gosh, are you saying that it was okay? It happened? Absolutely not. What we're saying is, or what I'm saying is that what we want to do is look at not what happened, but the impact it had on us, the core decisions we made about ourselves and the world. And then from there, the core vibration that we've carried with us, and then all the strategies that we've used, whether that's addiction, whatever it is, we've used something to try to manage it. Now, right in this moment, we have everything within us to heal that and to start to have different conclusions about ourselves and the world. And then we can start to see our the relationship start to shift. Almost seems like it's magic. Oh my gosh, suddenly more loving people are around me. Sometimes it's the same person. I remember, just thinking my mom should be more loving. And, I had a wonderful mother, but my mother she is just not the nurturing kind. It's not who she is, right? And in my early 20s, I just thought, I was still holding on to this story that she should be more nurturing. She should be more interested in my life. I heard myself say that. And I thought, I'm not even expressing interest in her life. Let me start to shift the core belief I have about myself, those core wounds. Let me start to be curious about her. That relationship had a profound healing. And it wasn't like we had to go back and re-examine everything that she did that caused me harm. It was that I did some of my own personal healing work. I started to offer her what I was wanting her to offer me, and things started to heal. And from that, there have been times, I can think of one time where she said, can we talk about some stuff? And she really opened up about some things she had shame about. So it was kind of like, if she could just apologize for this, then I could be free. And then I realized that in the process of doing my own healing, it created a space for her to she did come and talk about some of that. And there was an even deeper healing at that point.
That is so beautiful. And that's the safety.
Yeah.
You created the safety in your relationship for that healing to occur.
I love that. Thank you. I've never really been able to see it quite that way until you said that. That's right. And I created the safety because I realized that this insidious idea that she should do this, this, and this so I could be free. In my mind, I'm like, what if it never happens? I'm not going to say it never is going to happen, but what if it never does happen? Can I still be free? That was the starting point. Well, what would that require if she's not going to do it? Because we have this idea, if they just apologize to me, then I'll be free. And it doesn't, sometimes they don't apologize. Let's start with that. But it also doesn't really create freedom. It can help. But the deeper work here is healing, as I'm repeating myself a lot, but healing those core false beliefs and that vibration, that creates a deeper healing than anything that they're ever going to do for us or to us.
Thank you, TJ. Oh my gosh, we could talk for another hour just about this. There's so much, so it's such a rich conversation, but I want to be mindful of your very precious time. Is there anything that you want to add? We're talking with TJ Woodward, the author of Conscious Recovery. You can find him at tjwoodward.com, and I will post links in the description below. But is there anything that you want to leave us with before we close the show?
Yeah, I think I want to, two things are coming to mind. One is just gratitude for you. This has been an incredible conversation, and you've created a safe space for us to actually explore this. We've been co-curious. I love that. And the last thing I want to say to anyone watching or listening right now is, if no one's told you today, you're a whole and perfect being. You came into this world as a precious spark of light, and that is still who and what you are. There's a place within you that's unharmed and unharmable. And at any moment, you have the ability to remember and recognize that.
Thank you so much for that, TJ. That's so beautiful. And thank you for spending this hour with us. I just appreciate you so much. And I want to send you so much love. Be well. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe and check out one of these other lovely videos. Thanks for being part of this community. Lots of love. Namaste.